Hi, as Joe mentioned, I'm Melissa Redmiles from the University of Maryland, and I'm here to present some work that I did with Michelle Mazurek and our undergraduate assistant, Amy Malone, on how users learn to be secure. So, as we all know, there's a multitude of advice available to users. So the US Computer Emergency Readiness Team offers 30,000 words of advice, which is about half the average novel. And this advice is on 60 different digital security topics. That's just one source. McAfee offers another 40,000 words, and if you go through all the Google results, you'll find more and more and more. And for physical security, there's almost an equal amount of advice. And so somehow users are filtering through all of the advice and rejecting most of it and picking some of it to take. And we wanted to understand how that filtering process worked. So we wanted to understand where users got advice, but more importantly, how they evaluate advice and how they decide what of that millions of thousands of words to take. And then finally, we wanted to know whether users with different backgrounds made different types of choices. So are users who are security sensitive or users with different socioeconomic backgrounds doing different things? And so in order to evaluate this, we conducted a semi-structured interview study. And we wanted to conduct an interview study rather than a closed answer survey or more quantitative method because no prior work has looked at why and how users are making this analysis, and we wanted to have the flexibility to really get into their reasoning beyond just what's the prevalence of what they're doing. And so it was also very important to us to have a very diverse participant base so that we were drawing reasonable and generalizable conclusions. So we recruited our participants by Craigslist, emails to companies, and flyering, and then we conducted these hour-long interviews with 25 participants. And so what did we talk to them about? We focused on both digital and physical security because we were curious to see if the more well-developed domain of physical security could offer some information on what we could do better in digital security. So we asked about authentication and passwords, antivirus use, online banking and shopping, as well as two-factor authentication. And then in physical security, we asked how they secured their homes, how they secured their method of transit, and then also how they stayed safe in walking alone at night. And when we were asking about these different behaviors, we were using this to facilitate questions about how they learned these behaviors, what were their information sources, why did they choose to practice the behaviors they practiced or reject other strategies, and did they see advice that they did and didn't take. And then also, did they have negative experiences with certain behaviors, and what did they learn from them? And then finally, we asked in general, if you were to go look for digital security advice or physical security advice, where would you look, how would you do it, what would you evaluate? And so after we conducted these interviews, we analyzed and coded them. So what does that mean? We had the interviews transcribed word by word. Then two researchers read all of the interview transcripts and developed a code book. That means they looked for common phrases, say multiple participants saying, "I received advice from a man," and they designated male advice as a code. And so we generated around 40 codes. And then the two researchers independently coded all of the interview transcripts and then came back together to evaluate how well their codes matched on each transcript. In this case, there was about a 75% intercoder agreement rate, which is reasonable for an exploratory study such as this one. And then we iterated to make sure we agreed on the final codes. And finally, we looked through all of those codes and identified the main themes that I'll talk about in the rest of the talk. So before we get to the themes, who are our participants? So we had 25 participants, and our university is located in the Washington, D.C. area. And so our participants were slightly more female than the D.C. area, and they were also wealthier. But they did have educational attainment representative of our area, and they were also racially representative. And so we do think that they give a reasonable representation of how users might be thinking and evaluating advice. And in general, DC is a bit more racially diverse and better educated than the US. So what did we find out? We found some interesting trends in how users evaluate advice, how security sensitivity impacts advice sources and beliefs, and then the usefulness of negative security experiences. So focusing first on advice evaluation, we asked for each behavior, why did you choose to use or not to use this particular strategy? And what we found out was that participants tended to evaluate digital security advice based on how much they trusted the source. So if their dad gave them some advice and they trusted their dad as a digital security authority, they took his advice wholesale. But with physical security advice, they actually kind of assessed the information that dad gave them and decided whether it made sense for them. And so one participant said, with computer security, I'm securing myself from threats that I don't even know anything about. I know when somebody walks up with a gun that I should be worried. And so in addition to this sort of evaluation difference, we also heard that it's very hard for digital security to be tangible. I don't know whether there's a threat. I don't know how to evaluate what this means for me. And so that brings up the question of whether maybe we can bring this physical security tangibility into the digital domain. And then participants also rejected advice for containing too much marketing and for threatening their privacy. So this was in addition to kind of the regular reasons of inconvenience and lack of risk, and it occurred almost equally as often. And so one participant said, I don't take any advice with a price tag attached. I did have my identity stolen one time, but I was able to fix it. I'm not one of those people who signs up for identity theft protection or anything like that. And so in addition to not liking marketing material in their advice, we heard from 3 participants the sort of disdain for anyone who would take advice that contained marketing material or buy security tools. And then with regard to privacy, one participant said, I think I do have that 2-factor authentication capacity, but I've always declined. Based on what I know about Gmail, it just seemed like giving up too much information to Google. And so this we heard multiple times, was I don't want to give up my phone number, I don't want to give up my private data, and whatever possible security benefit I get from 2-factor can't possibly be worth the risk that they're going to call me or text me. And so that's sort of an important consideration we hadn't thought about before. With regard to security sensitivity, and again, security sensitivity was whether someone held a government security clearance or worked with HIPAA or FERPA data, which is health or student data that's government controlled. And so we found that these security sensitive users differed in behavior, sources, and beliefs. So talking about 2-factor again, they were much more likely to use 2-factor authentication than general participants. And perhaps this is because they better understood the trade-offs, or they thought security is more important. That's kind of an area for future research to explore why. And then also they had different sources of advice. So the workplace was far more often a source of advice for these participants than it was for general participants. So it's also possible that they're getting maybe better advice from their workplace that's telling them to use 2-factor, and so therefore they're going to be a bit more secure. And then finally, they also felt that digital security advice was more useful than the general participants did. So general participants tended to think it was equally useful as physical, or physical was more useful, but security sensitive thought digital security advice is more useful. And then finally, we wanted to talk about negative security experiences. So prior work has emphasized the importance of negative security experiences or stories of those experiences in teaching new behaviors. And so we chose to ask our participants whether they'd ever had a negative experience. And so what we found out was, in addition to echoing prior work that these experiences are important, and all but one of our participants cited learning from a negative experience, we also heard that the experience didn't have to happen to them, and it didn't have to be the story of a friend. People were citing these experiences coming out of TV shows, and they were saying things like, I put a password on my Wi-Fi network after watching a TV show. It showed people going by houses and Wi-Fi snooping. Shows like that, they make you think. And so we heard from a couple of participants this sort of strong memory of making a distinct behavior change based on a television show. And so that leads to our first design recommendation, which is we don't want users to go through these negative experiences, and we don't want their friends to have to go through them to tell them stories. So can we take fictional vignettes to simulate these negative experiences? Can we create short commercials or other types of stories to have the same teaching impact that a negative security experience might? And so that's an area, for future development and work. Then also, as we mentioned, marketing material and the advice made users much more likely to reject it. And so it's important to take a look at where marketing messaging is occurring in security advice and try to avoid the perception of marketing. And then also, we looked at the effect of security sensitivity, and we saw some interesting trends there. But as this is qualitative, we don't know the prevalence of those trends, so that's also an area for future work. With regard to two-factor authentication and the privacy concerns that users brought up, it's again important to explore how prevalent that is, and if it's shown to be equally as prevalent, to look at how we can reassure users about privacy, even in security behaviors. And then finally, we found, although not mentioned here, that primary sources of advice for users were family and friends and the media. And so instead of overloading users with more and more advice from more and more places, we should try to pare down what we're giving them and send it through pre-existing channels. So in summary, we wanted to find out where users got advice, why they took it, and how we can make it better. We conducted a semi-structured interview with 25 participants, and we found that trust of source was a key metric for digital security, but not physical. That advice is getting rejected not just because it's inconvenient or users think they're not at risk, but also because it contains marketing material or threatens their privacy. And then finally, that security-sensitive participants differ in a number of important ways, and that's something we want to explore further. Thank you.
Okay, we have plenty of time for questions, so please go up to the microphones.
So you reminded me of this claim that teenagers are more likely to use birth control if they've watched the show 16 and Pregnant. Why don't we produce a series called 16 and Hacked?
I would
or
love
16
to do that.
Hacked and Pregnant.
I would love to do that. And actually in the paper, I cite some work where they showed that a Friends episode, increased teens talking to their parents about pregnancy. So if we could get something about hacking into whatever today's Friends is, that would be awesome.
Hi, thanks. I thought that was pretty good. I have a question, I guess, more about what to do next. So I don't want you to take this as that I think that this is the wrong thing to do. Physical security to me, I guess, would have some evolutionary benefit that might be hooked in, which makes it a little bit more intuitive. Have you thought about comparing not digital security to physical security, but some other physical task that is also maybe not so refined in some sort of like animal way, like how to fix a car or something?
We thought a little bit after we started doing this about maybe comparing to like health and, eating healthy is maybe a thing you don't have to do, but you should do, maybe that comparison or fixing a car. We haven't done it, but I think it's a good idea. Yeah.
Jung, Microsoft Research, really interesting work. So would you say a little bit about this marketing that adversely impact the people's I guess I'm not taking this advice. So a while ago, one company had this campaign, marketing campaign that says, we are much better than the other competitor on privacy. So there are lots of, it was not TV ad, but there's lots of online ad and YouTube ads. And then I heard that later so they were also collecting data about how people were signing more petition for asking this company not to use my email content for advertising and so on. And I saw that, the the ads really worked. So I was a little surprised to hear that, some people did not want to take this advice from, professionally created marketing campaign.
Yeah, and I think that was sort of an important distinction was that people were interested in the authority of the advice. So like if a researcher at Google was giving advice, they didn't take that as marketing material. I think marketing came about when it was like they felt like they were being pressured into using a tool or pressured into paying for a tool or talking about paying for a tool within general security advice. So I think that's sort of something we'd want to look at is like what exact type of marketing really bothers them versus seems authoritative from a company. Yeah.
I guess I had a quick follow-up to that. Did you separate between kind of online services people were using that give them advice and their operating system or mobile operating system giving them advice when they're setting up?
Yeah, so we did code for like prompts or automatic or things like that, yes.
Did you notice any, I mean, no, it was a small group of people. Did you notice any trend between Mac and Windows or Android and iOS?
Yeah, we noticed definitely a trend of, I have a Mac and therefore I don't need to do X, Y, Z. I also heard that from Linux users who were security professionals, which I was a little like shaky on. But so we did hear that, but there were no discernible trends as to like what people said that versus that.